Are we there? We're close. Good morning, church. Good morning. It's good to be with you today. Happy Sabbath. And we had an earthquake. Welcome to Southern California, I guess, for us. And maybe for some of you, if you're new, welcome on our behalf. That was the first earthquake. David Wren has been texting me over the last month saying, did you feel that? Did you feel that? No, I felt nothing. And I had resolved myself that I needed to be in his presence or in someone who was from here when one occurred in order for me to be able to detect it. But I was alone last night. I did not need any assistance. Mercy. So I have a little short video of my younger son sharing a little bit about his experience with the earthquake. I think we have the video. Do we have it? Yes. No. No, we don't have it. Okay. Well, there's a cute video. Maybe we'll put it on Facebook. It's all good. Or we'll get it again. We'll get it again, Soy. Don't worry. So, I joked on Facebook though this week that it made my sermon preparation on the subject of feeling anxious more difficult, having gone through that experience, and that's definitely the case. Paige and I grew up in Walla Walla together. We were in first grade together when we first became friends. And when we started dating, I was still finishing school. I was kind of one of those 6-year plan people where I went on a student mission year and did more than one major and all this stuff. And Paige had made short work of it, and she was done. So she was selling real estate full-time. And we were engaged. And I remember there was this dynamic that came up in our relationship early on, like that year where we were engaged, and then our first year of marriage was my last year of school, where I would call her during the day just to check in, and I would just, call, and I wouldn't have anything to say, so I would just call and say, hey, bud, hey, hi, well, see you later. And that was it. And I would call, but I would call frequently, more than once a day, to sort of have that unsubstantial conversation. And there would be times where Paige would not answer the phone. She was busy. She was working. She would have an appointment, or she'd be with a client, or something would be going on, or whatever. And she would not answer the phone. And some of the time, I would begin thinking about the meaning behind her not happening to answer the phone at that given time. And particularly if there were more than one phone calls during the day and where she didn't answer, those thoughts would kind of evolve and develop and mature. And so sometimes I would start thinking, well, I wonder what happened. I wonder did something happen to her? Something wrong? Is she mad at me? Did I say something? Did I do something? What was that thing that happened when we were at the restaurant? I looked at her that one way, and then she's probably gone, and now it's gone. She's probably moved out of her house, and we're probably broken up, and there's probably nothing going to happen, and I'm never going to be happy. And it was sort of like this, this anxious freak out thing would start to evolve, right? My mind would just start rolling. It's feeling anxious. I would get on kind of that frenzy. And some of us here are familiar with that sort of feeling. And then inevitably, when she would answer the phone, she'd say, hi, honey, how's it going? And it would all drop away. And there would be nothing. And there was no problem at all. It was just my own anxiety building up. So most of us are familiar with the sensation of feeling anxious. Yeah, most of us are familiar with that sensation of being jittery or being on edge or being nervous. If you're not, you had the earthquake this week to help you with that. But having racing thoughts, where our mind is rolling from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, our muscles are tight and tense. That unpleasant feeling of overanalyzing the conversation that we had or the one that we need to have. or the one that's coming, or the powerlessness and dread over the thing that's going to happen right away. And brilliant stuff. Thank you, Heather, for the beautiful imagery. That is it. That captures it. Our anxiety in front of our face. You know, a couple of years ago, I stumbled across a hashtag, what anxiety feels like. And it's still there on Twitter. So if you search for it, you can find it. But there were all kinds of interesting, I think, telling and true observations of what it feels like to live in worry or to live in anxiety. One of them was, it feels like having had 3 too many cups of coffee today. Right? Anxiety feels like reading the text that I'm about ready to send for the 100th time and then reading it for 101 times after I sent it. Yep, that's one of them. Lying awake in bed because I'm stressed, right? And then stressing because I can't sleep. And then feeling more stressed and unable to sleep because of the stress about having that stress. I loved this picture I saw. What could possibly go wrong? Anxiety. I'm glad you asked. Just those continual rolling. But, at least in my experience, anxiety or feeling anxious isn't just unpleasant. It's also frustratingly unproductive. And I think this is an observation that Jesus makes for us in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, has anyone ever added a single moment to their life? Other versions read, has anyone added a single inch to their height by worrying? And then it goes on, think about the lilies of the field. Some of you here are familiar with this text. Think about the lilies of the field. They don't toil or spin, the old version of it, and yet not even Solomon in all of his glory was dressed like one of them. Every day has enough trouble of its own, he concludes. Tomorrow will worry about itself. And even though it doesn't typically lead us to a solution, at least in my life, feeling anxious kind of tends to trick me into thinking that it really is helpful and that it really is useful and that it really is going to solve the problem, and so it just wraps itself tighter and tighter and tighter. Worry is circular. It's self-referencing, as the author and Professor Francis O'Gorman writes in his book About, with that title, Worry. He writes, worry is the opposite of a lighthouse. It doesn't give out energy for the benefit of others. It absorbs energy at others' costs, and probably me first, being the first one it costs. An often repeated story from the scriptures, I think, illustrates a little bit about how our anxiety can lead us to miss out on important moments. There's this narrative that shows up in Luke chapter 10. Jesus, maybe some of you are familiar with it. Jesus shows up at the house of a couple of sisters. They're named Mary and Martha. He shows up at their house, and the dialogue describes how one of the sisters, Mary, sits at the feet of Jesus, learning from him with all of the men, all of the disciples, while her sister Martha is scurrying around the house, taking care of matters of hospitality and serving food and conceivably a whole bunch of other things. And there comes a point in the story where Martha comes to Jesus and asks him to intervene. She's frustrated that her sister isn't doing anything to help, and so says, Jesus, make my sister help me out here, right? And Jesus responds to her frantic request, Martha, Martha, you're worried and anxious about many things, but few are needed. Between the lines, we might be able to read, Martha, your anxiety has run amok. You're missing out on something else that's beautiful here. Here's the thing, at least for me, as unhelpful and as unpleasant as anxiety and as feeling worry can be, I think it's a mistake to imagine that it's a sin or that it's somehow unspiritual if we have that in our lives, or that it's some kind of sign of immaturity. Many of the interpretations of Luke chapter 10 that I'm familiar with and maybe the same for you, when they look at this story. I mean, some of the really great ones talk about gender roles, and we're not going to talk about that right now, but those are some great ones. You should explore those. But many of the interpretations are about personality types, about personality differences between different people. And so Mary is kind of the social person, and Martha's kind of the more of the type A, get it done person. And so I've heard many people teach on this story and talk about how we all relate to things differently and how we need to make space for each other. We need to have grace for each other. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think that we could make similar observations about our worry, and particularly about our different levels of sensitivity to worry. And I think there is a spectrum there. And I think some of us are more sensitive to anxiety than others among us. And I don't think that it's an indicator of whether or not we're good people or whether we're sinful if we happen to be people that are more sensitive to anxiety. You know, this past week we celebrated the 4th of July. Many of us did. We remembered and thanked remembered and had gratitude for being able to live in a place where we can worship according to our conscience, for example, among any other things. Now, you know, one of the things that goes along with 4th of July, and we experienced it. Do we have a picture? I didn't see it on the monitor. Yeah, you saw them. So one of the things we experienced was fireworks as a part of that. And you know, I don't think any of us here would shame someone perhaps a former soldier who had gone through combat and who lives today with PTSD and who has a high level of sensitivity around hearing and experiencing fireworks everywhere. I don't think any of us would shame a person who has that experience, or we would say that they're a bad person or that they're immature, right? None of us would do that. No. We wouldn't say that that person is unspiritual because their body reacts in unpredictable ways because of this past trauma, these past experiences that they've gone through. No. We would say because of what we've gone through, because of who we are, we all have different levels of sensitivity. And I think something similar is true as it relates to worry or feeling anxious. And so for a variety of reasons, whether it's personality or experiences we've had or things that we've gone through, our histories, I think some of us are more tolerant to certain stresses than others. And so no matter where you find yourself at on the spectrum, whether you're someone who tends to live and be a little more anxious just in your own life, or if you tend to be someone who lives with someone who is a little more anxious, no matter where you're at on the spectrum, I think this series and this sermon will have something for you. For some of us, it will be about learning to empathize and understand with people that really kind of are on edge a little more. And for some of us who are on edge a little more, maybe we'll have, I hope that you'll find some tools and some useful things, and maybe even be able to empathize with yourself a little bit, but hopefully some stuff to cope and to deal with. And I think this is a good moment for a disclaimer. So we're just going to step out of the flow of the sermon just for 1 minute. I want to say something about, and I joked with Dave, I met with David Wren, we had some warm beverages together this week, and I joked with David Wren that I felt like this whole sermon was a sermon of disclaimers. So if you feel like, all right, quit with the disclaimer, we have just one more disclaimer, really quick. I want to say something about scope of practice, and I want to be sure to stay in my lane. I want to stay in my lane. My profession is as a theologian and as a pastor, so I'm not a therapist. So I'm gonna do my very best in this series to stay in my lane. And having said that, psychology and spirituality, they kind of have this overlap, and I'm not yet aware of the grand unifying theory of psychology and spirituality. Let me know if you're aware of it. So the scope of this series is about the feeling of feeling anxious. It's about worry. I'm not making an effort to discuss, clinically significant anxiety disorders. Are you with me? Right? So I'm not. That's not my hope or intent to discuss that stuff here. And I'm going to use the word anxiety throughout, but what I mean by it is worry. Feeling anxious, the sense of being on edge. So we're going to be focusing kind of on spiritual advice. And just one more bit is, I don't think any of us should feel stigmatized or embarrassed if we have clinically significant anxiety. The person, the pastor who's preaching on the stage has made use of and will in the future will make use of professionals in the mental health world. So I don't think any of us should feel stigmatized about that and about needing more advanced help. Okay, so there's the disclaimer. Now back. So far where we've been, to kind of summarize, right? Most of us are familiar with worry. Most of us know it's uncomfortable, it's unproductive, it's problematic. So here's the question I want to look at with kind of the bulk of the rest of the sermon, is where does it come from? Where does it come from? How does it work? There's lots of texts that speak about feeling anxious in the Bible. Don't be anxious about anything from Philippians, but in every situation, present your requests to God with thanksgiving, right? Fear not, for I am with you, from Isaiah. Fear not, for I am your God. Don't be anxious. I will uphold you with my mighty right hand. Cast all your anxieties on God. This is one of the favorites, for he cares for you, from 2 Peter. And Jesus, come to me, all you who worry and who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The scriptures speak over and over and over again about anxiety or about feeling worry. And I don't think these texts are principally saying that we should repress those feelings, or we should pretend like we're not having them, or that we should say that we're sinning if we have them. I think that these texts are more saying, just don't let it drive the ship, right? Don't act like it's not there, but don't let it drive the ship. How many of you, just by way of hands, how many of you heard of Lee Iacocca? Some of you. And you guys heard about he passed away this week, yeah, right? Did anybody hear about that? So I have to admit, I was more familiar with the name than, so I had to learn a little bit about Lee this week. And one of the things is that he is responsible for the Mustang, the Ford Mustang, a vehicle that I rode in this week, and a vehicle that I used to own at one point in my life. He was responsible for the Mustang. He was also responsible for the minivan. The minivan. What opposite ends of the spectrum, right? The Mustang and the minivan. And like I said, at one time, this is me right out of college, I had a Mustang. It was given to me by my parents and grandparents. They pooled together and got me a Mustang. And then my son was born a few years later, and he was 1 year old. My back was starting to hurt because I was putting him in the back seat of this coupe. And there was, so a few years later, and one cooler set of wheels later, I had to say goodbye to the Mustang, and it was very shortly replaced with a minivan, which we have today, which is great. It has this clicker, and the doors open on their own, and some of you know what I'm talking about, the minivan. But there's this arc, right, from Mustang to minivan, from risk-taking to boring, and not to safe, right? From impractical to practical, right? There's this arc, and we all kind of move across that arc in different ways, in different places, and I made that shift, and some of you still haven't made that shift yet. Some of you are resisting the shift from the Mustang to the minivan, but here's where I'm going with all of this. All of us have an inner risk manager. We all have a safety officer that lives inside of us, that looks out for us, that tries to keep us safe, that tries to take care of us. We all have a safety officer. We have someone inside of us who tries, to make us feel like things are okay. And for some of us, like we've already sort of established, for some of us we have kind of a laissez-faire safety officer who, lets us jump out of perfectly good airplanes and stuff like that. And then others of us have a safety officer that's a little more stalwart. And I won't do show of hands, but you know who you are. Some of us, we know who our safety officer is. There's and this is the second time I'll talk about a Disney movie in just a month from the pulpit. But there's this film called Inside Out, and and it was by Disney, and it personifies different emotions. So it gives each emotion a character, right? And one of the themes of the film is that it explores what happens when anger runs the show. What happens if we have no joy ever? What happens if we have no sadness ever? And for the purposes of this sermon, what happens when fear runs the show? What happens with anxiety runs the show? And one kind of the point of the whole program is, listen, we need all of these different things, but if any one of them is totally absent, or if any one of them completely is in charge and pushes all the others out, major problems occur. And I think something is similar is very true about our anxiety. The point isn't try to completely eliminate it, but it's also true that problems come if it's running the show. If there's a certain amount of balance that's useful. We need the inner fear manager. Sometimes the minivan is the appropriate thing to have. It's a useful thing to have in our lives. We just don't want him or her to run the show. This last week, I listened to several sermons about anxiety, just kind of, I wanted to see what other people were saying. And one of them I listened to talked about Elijah. They talked about how Elijah was this person who exemplifies anxiety and how he was running from this despotic king and, running from Jezebel. And it told the story about how you got to read the story if you haven't, if you're not familiar with it. But he ends up in a cave and he's hiding from this queen who wants to kill him. And he prays to God, God, why aren't you here? Where are you at? What are you going to do? Here I am, I'm all alone, and you've abandoned me, and everyone wants me dead, right? And so the sermon was all about how he was this super anxious person, but honestly, I kind of take exception to that. I don't think that he was anxious at all. I think he was afraid of a very specific, acute issue that he had in his life at that moment. He wasn't anxious. He didn't have this sort of broad, whatever, random. He had a very specific fear to something that he ought to have been afraid of. I don't think that worry was Elijah's challenge. I don't think anxiety is that organized. It's not on top of, we have this saying in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe you guys have it here, but we have this saying in the Pacific Northwest amongst people that hike and backpack about bears. And what we say is that when it comes to a bear attacking you, all you need to be is faster than the slowest person in your group, right? Do you guys have something similar? I know that snakes don't chase you really here, but anyway, that's what we say. When it comes to a bear attack, you just need to be faster than the slowest person in your group, and you'll be fine. You'll be fine. And anxiety, it's not focused on a particular threat. That's not how anxiety works. It's not focused on a bear or a crazy queen. It's not focused on a clown chasing you or whatever it happens to be. Anxiety is focused on a million possible random things that are completely unrelated. Anxiety is this messed up thing. Worry is not a fight. It's not the fight or flight response that comes with this specific threat that's right in front of me. It's this chronic sense of fear. It's this chronic preoccupation that there could be a bear or that there could be a whatever coming our way. Anxiety is incoherent. It's not a point A to point B experience. It's focused on possibilities. It's focused on what might happen. There's this great quote from the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard. Anxiety comes from the dizziness of freedom. It's the wide open space. It's all the crazy many different things that are out there that could maybe hurt us. And I think it's that lack of coherence that gives anxiety its energy. And so the answer to our worry it's not learning how to have courage. I don't think that's the answer, because there's a million different things that we'd have to figure out how to have courage about. And I don't think it's even necessarily exploring where our anxiety comes from, because it's illogical and incoherent. And so now I've dug ourselves into a really deep hole, right? So where does that lead us? Courage is crazy. It's this random thing. It's this mess of tangled web. Well, how is that for a teaser for the rest of this series, right? It's like, okay, there's the invitation to binge watch this. But, really, we are going to look in the rest of this series, a couple more weeks. Next week, we're going to look specifically at what are some things that we do that are constructive and deconstructive to cope with anxiety. What are some things we can actually do? And then on the 20th, we're going to look at inoculation. We're going to look at preventing. What are some habits we can put in place to keep it from taking over our lives? And obviously, these themes are interrelated. As I was working on this series, I was thinking, man, this is completely arbitrary how we dice and slice this out, but there are 3 Sabbaths to look at it. But I'm not going to leave you hanging. I want to close today with some truth, the namesake of today's sermon. I want to close today with one suggestion for how we can deal with this, and then we'll look at some more in the coming weeks, all right? There's a saying that Jesus gives in John chapter 14 that some of us are familiar with. My peace I leave you. My peace I give you. It's a beautiful line from a beautiful chapter of Scripture, John chapter 14. And it comes in the context of a dialogue that takes place in John chapter 13. Jesus is talking with his disciples. It's toward the end of his life. It's toward the end of his ministry. And he's explaining to them about the things that are going to happen. He's talking about his death. He's talking about the suffering that he's going to go through. And then he starts talking about how his disciples are going to abandon him and about how one is even going to betray him. And you can kind of feel a little bit of their anxiety building, right? You can kind of feel some of their worry. Who's it going to be? Who's going to do it? How's it going to unfold? Wonder what's going to happen to me. Am I going to have to suffer? Am I going to go through this? What's going to happen to him? How could this possibly be that possible way? I thought he was going to take over and he was going to be the king. You can kind of feel their anxiety building there in John chapter 13. You even hear Peter in that text lash out at Jesus. No, it's not going to go that way. And to their anxiety, into their worry, Jesus speaks. John chapter 14. He encourages them, reminding them of a couple of things they can be confident in. Doesn't deal with all their specific worries, but he reminds them of 1 or 2 or 3 truths that can help soothe them. And it starts there in John chapter 14. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms, and if that were not so, I would have told you. I've told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you, and if I go to prepare a place, I will come back and take you with me, that you may be where I am. He goes on, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father through me. If you know me, if you really know me, you know my Father as well. From now on, you know who he is, and you have seen him. All this I have spoken while I'm still with you, he concludes. But the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and remind you everything I've said to you. And then this verse, peace I leave you. My peace I give you. I do not give it as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and afraid. Jesus essentially says, you belong to God. He made you. You are his. You belong to God. And God the Father, he is good. When you've seen me and the good that I have, he says, you have seen God. You belong to God, and he is a good Father, and his love is extravagant. His love is beyond anything we could possibly ask or imagine. There's all kinds of things that we don't know. We don't know the details of how it's going to play out. We don't know what's going to come up in our life. We don't know if there's going to be another earthquake this afternoon. We don't know. There are all kinds of things that we don't know. There's questions and possibilities and fears and problems and surprises, and our anxiety reminds us of them. It's very creative. But I think we can have a confidence in a few things. I think there are a few things that are bedrock. I think there are a few things that are deeply, deeply true that confront these aimless worries. Jesus says in another place, the truth will set you free. And that's my prayer for us this week. Let me pray. Dear Jesus, you said, my peace I leave with you. And very often we find ourselves in the opposite of peace. We worry. And sometimes it takes over everything we can see. We can only see that worry blowing up in front of us bigger and bigger. For some of us, it keeps us up at night. It's unproductive. It takes our energy away from other things. We miss out on the goodness and beauty of life because we're anxious. And dear Jesus, whether we find ourselves by personality those who are stressing or those who are love those who live in that, I pray that you give us empathy for ourselves. May we treat ourselves as you treat us. May we see ourselves through your eyes, the one who loves us exactly as we are. Jesus, may the truths, those few beautiful, huge truths that we are yours, that you are good, that we are loved, may those infuse everything in our lives and soothe those fears. Be with us now as we walk with our heads up and our eyes clear as we follow you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Happy Sabbath. Blessings.